1963, Africa stood at a crossroads. 32 African leaders gathered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Many had only recently won independence from European colonial rule. The flags had changed. The national anthems had changed. African leaders were finally in charge of African countries. A debate that asked a simple but powerful question: should Africa unite as one nation, or should African countries remain independent states pursuing their own paths? To answer that question, we must return to the early years of African independence. The late 1950s and early 1960s were years of excitement and hope across Africa. European colonial empires were beginning to crumble. One after another, African nations gained independence. Ghana became independent in 1957. Nigeria followed in 1960. Many others soon joined them. Across the continent, a new generation of African leaders emerged. These leaders had fought colonial rule. They had inspired nationalist movements. And now they faced an even bigger challenge. How could Africa secure its future in a world still dominated by powerful Western nations? For Kwame Nkrumah, the answer was clear. Africa must unite. Nkrumah believed political independence alone was not enough. He argued that Africa could only be truly free if it united into a single political and economic bloc. Without unity, he warned, Africa would become vulnerable to foreign influence, economic dependence, and political instability. But then something happened. Several African leaders rejected his proposal. Among the strongest opponents was the president of Côte d'Ivoire, Félix Houphouët-Boigny. And this is where the story becomes interesting. Because Houphouët-Boigny was not a colonial governor and European cohort, he was an African nationalist who had fought for the interests of his people. Yet he strongly opposed Nkrumah's vision. Why? What did he see that Nkrumah did not? Or was he protecting interests that extended beyond Africa? To understand this, we need to go back a few years. Unlike Nkrumah, Houphouët-Boigny believed that African countries should first strengthen themselves before attempting political union. He argued that every African nation had its own culture, economy, political system, and challenges. In his view, forcing all African countries into a single government too quickly could create instability and conflict. But there was another important factor: France. Even after independence, Côte d'Ivoire maintained extremely close ties with its former colonial ruler. French businesses remained active in the country. French investment continued to flow into the Ivorian economy. French influence remained significant. For Nkrumah and many Pan-Africanists, this relationship represented a dangerous form of neo-colonialism. Political independence had been achieved, but economic dependence remained. Nkrumah saw this as a threat to true African freedom. Houphouët-Boigny saw it as a practical path to development. And so a rivalry emerged, not merely between two men, but between two visions for Africa. On one side stood Ghana, on the other stood Côte d'Ivoire. The disagreement between Nkrumah and Houphouët-Boigny was not merely ideological. It became a competition between two models of development. Ghana, under Nkrumah, pursued an ambitious state-led development strategy. The government invested heavily in education, industrialization, infrastructure, and Pan-African projects. Massive projects such as the Akosombo Dam were intended to transform Ghana into an industrial powerhouse and a leader of African unity. However, these projects required enormous spending. By the mid-1960s, Ghana faced rising debts, economic difficulties, and graying political opposition. Meanwhile, Côte d'Ivoire followed a different path. Houphouët-Boigny maintained close economic and political ties with France. French investment flowed into the country. Agricultural exports, especially cocoa and coffee, generated significant revenues. For years, Côte d'Ivoire experienced rapid economic growth, earning what many called the Ivorian miracle. Supporters of Houphouët-Boigny pointed to Côte d'Ivoire's prosperity as proof that gradual development and cooperation with the West were more effective than Nkrumah's revolutionary Pan-Africanism. The rivalry became a real-life contest between two competing visions for Africa's future. Instead of a political union, they supported cooperation between independent states. Their position ultimately prevailed. The result was the creation of the Organization of African Unity, or OAU. The OAU promoted cooperation and solidarity among African states, but stopped far short of creating the United States of Africa that Nkrumah envisioned. For Nkrumah, this was a devastating defeat. The dream of immediate continental political union was effectively shelved. More than 60 years later, the consequences of that debate are still visible. Africa remains divided into 54 sovereign states. Many countries maintain separate currencies, trade policies, military structures, and diplomatic priorities. Critics argue that Nkrumah's warnings proved correct. Foreign powers continue to wield significant influence across the continent. Intra-African trade remains relatively low compared to Europe and Asia. Regional conflicts and political fragmentation continue to challenge African development. And even today, the question remains, what if Nkrumah had won? Would Africa be stronger, richer, and more influential? Or would the dream of a United States of Africa have collapsed under its own weight? The debate continues. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the African Archive for more untold stories from African history. Do you believe Africa would be stronger today if Nkrumah's dream of a United States of Africa had become reality? Let me know in the comments section. See you in the next video.